Good evening. Happy Friday. Welcome to our weekly AMA, which is just stands for Ask Me Anything. I'm here to answer all of your data engineering questions, whether it be about how to get into data engineering, or maybe you're already in data engineering, you have questions about certain processes or just how things are done, or maybe you have a specific Python or SQL question you want to ask. Throw them in the chat. Let me know as we go. But today, we're going to specifically go over 5 of the things that a lot of fresher data engineers really fall into it. 5 of it, bad habits that they pick up and things that they just don't think about. Some mistakes that they make along the way in their career. So that's the topic for tonight. Again, as always, let me know down in the chat that you're here. Say hello. Let me know where you're from, and happy that you're here. Thank you. And again, like I said, stop me, ask questions at any time. So that is what we're going over today. Have you ever spent, for you all that are new to data engineering, hey Gene, um, for y'all that are new to data engineering, have you ever spent days building a data pipeline only to realize that, you're really into it, and then you miss something like really early on, and you pretty much everything that you've done is just trash, right? Or maybe you have faced the nightmare where you have like perfectly written code. It is just pristine and great, and then it completely breaks when dealing with some real world crap that comes in, just because data has a tendency to be not clean, right? It has a tendency to have issues, and that's just the real world. So again, I'm Chris Gamble, and tonight we're going to talk about the 5 common pitfalls that every data engineer really falls into. Stick around, because I'm going to show you how to avoid these 5 fresher mistakes that people make. And hopefully by the end of the session, you'll be ready to tackle a lot of your projects confidently and when you walk into a data engineering role. So before we jump in, again, drop a quick note in the chat, just like Gene, and let us know what's the biggest mistake that you've made so far in your data journey. And again, this is a judgment-free zone. There's no judgment here. We're all busy, working our own thing, doing, a lot of you are career shifters and you've got a lot on your plate already. So you may not have a whole lot of time to dedicate to your learning, but let me know down in the chat, what big roadblock have you already run into on your data journey? So pitfall number 1 that fresher data engineers really fall into is overlooking data profiling. If you don't know what data profiling is, let me know in the chat too. I'll be happy to stop and go over it. But when you're starting a project, data profiling really is important. It's tempting to just jump into the coding, because that's the fun and exciting part, into creating your pipelines, really without digging into what the quirks and maybe the issues may be in your source data. Again, the data in real world is not as pristine as your testing data, as your education data that you see. A lot of people learn this the hard way. We probably all learned this the hard way, to truth be told. um, you know you might assume that an ID field is unique, and maybe it's not. Maybe all of a sudden, maybe that table has historical data. Um, okay, Gene asked me, please explain. So I'm going to explain what data profiling is. So data profiling is really, it's like EDA. It's very similar to EDA, and EDA is your exploratory data analysis. But data profiling is specific for data engineers in understanding what the structure of your data looks like, what the quirks and the issues are, what might not be whole, what might have some accidental text in a field that should be integer, some things like that, misspellings of names, misspell uh, have run into a lot of things over the years where a customer name might be Acme Inc. in one place, Acme Inc. with a period in another place, Acme comma Inc. just Acme. So, it really, that type of thing is you're profiling your data, really understanding all the quirks, all the issues, so that when you dive into your code, all those things so that you can adjust for them, so that you can, code around the issue or code for the issue, right? As you're cleaning your data. So that's kind of what data profiling is. Um, so again, a lot of times, it's really tempting to just jump in, and you're excited about it, and you want to just jump in there, and then you run into these issues where an ID field is not as unique as you thought it was. Um, Nathan's here. What's up, Nathan? Um, and uh, and sometimes the only way to find duplicates is later. Again, if you don't do your data profiling up front, and then you're spending hours, cleaning up the mess that was created because there's duplicate records, and now everybody's seen it, right? Because it's on a report somewhere. So, really, the big tip here is to always start your project with real thorough EDA or data profiling. Really, they go hand in hand. And again, the EDA is your exploratory data analysis, where you're really investigating that data source and understanding all the ins and outs of what that data looks like. Um, Tools like pandas. Again, we've gone over pandas in the past, and about how to use the describe function in pandas to get some information about your data set. That's a great way to profile some of your data. Just some exporting it to Excel and looking through it in Excel is a great way to explore it and understand what the structure and what that looks like. SQL queries, go ahead and import it into a staging table, run some SQL queries against it, try some different things, see what's going on with that, and and really will help save you time in the back end. Data profiling is one of those things that you either pay for it now or you're going to pay for it later. All right. So Nathan, his biggest challenge with data has been getting clean staging testing data. Similar enough to production without actually using production, especially changing. Yeah, especially if you're changing production data. Yeah. If you're lucky enough to work in a place where you have some access to production data and you can just make a copy of it and use it to play with and experiment with, that's a great thing to do, because a lot of times that production data may not be may be a great way to identify some issue that you could bring back and get yourself promoted within your current career. Um, but that's a challenge. That's like I mentioned when I was talking about the data profiling. That's a challenge, right? Because so much of data out there for education purposes is a little bit more pristine than real world data, and you don't get a chance to really practice data quality, data cleaning activities, because that data is already pretty home. Um, so so now, just like Nathan and Gene, for those, there's somebody else out there and you are not saying hello. Say hello to us. Um, you know, let us know that you're here, and we're a welcoming group. So again, pitfall number two, is that freshers don't think about scalability when they're building stuff. You know, it's just not a thought in their mind. Again, they're so used to dealing with that educational, that test data, that scaling has never been a concern for them. And so in the real world, though, your data builds up really quick. That table that started out with 10,000 records will quickly grow to 1 million records in a few weeks or a few months. And all of a sudden, by the end of the year, you have tens of millions of records. And so those tables grow quick, and ignoring scalability is a huge mistake. Again, just like your educational data, things might work initially, again, with a few thousand records or even a few 100,000 records. But when you get to that million, when you get to that 10 million point, you know, freshers especially often build solutions without thinking about that scaling, just because they hadn't had a reason to worry about it before. And that really causes issues down the line as that data grows. Again, it grows so much quicker than you could ever imagine. Um, so I want to take a poll of you all, those of you that are out there. How often do you think about scalability when you're coding something, whether it be a project that you're working on individually or in your current job now? You know, type in the comments always or sometimes or what's scaling, um, and let me know kind of where you're at with that. All right, so pitfall number three, hard coding values. This one is one of my pet peeves. Um, when people hard code, you know, things like where statements or hard code business logic in queries and ETL pipelines, it's just not a good practice because these things change. Um, hard coded paths for file locations, connection strings that are hard coded and not dynamic, dates. I've seen plenty of pipelines and SQL scripts and Sprock. Sprock's are stored procedures for those of you that may not know. Just SPROC, right? Stored procedure. But I've seen dates that are in Sprox that uh, where people were creating the Sprock and they were testing it and they hard coded a date in there. Well, 6 years down the line, that Sprock still is being used, and it's got a date in there from 10 years ago because at the time that they initially ran it, they needed some historical data when they ran it. And so, those, and all, people are wondering, man, every month or every year, uh, this ETL pipeline runs slower and slower, and it's because that Sprock has some hard coded date in there. So that's that's kind of a real world example that I've run into a few times. But or some magic numbers that seem harmless at first. Again, hard. This would be that hard coding business logic kind of scenario. But really, trust me, these things really do come back to haunt you, just like the example where the Sprock had the date in it and it started running longer and longer and longer, because it kept on running for 10 years every time it ran instead of just the incremental load. Um, so to be fair, again, I've seen my fair share of and done and been guilty of it in the past myself, where you're in a hurry trying to get something done, you just go ahead and hard code it because you don't have the time to make it table driven, and your stakeholders are really pressuring you and you just got to get it done, and you throw it in there. But please, store configurable items in external configurations or environment variables. Make sure that you're creating these variables, especially for things like connection strings and hard-coded paths. I've run into scenarios where I've come in to do consulting, and especially with Informatica, I don't know what the hang up is there. And I've seen this in Azure as well, where people will create 10, 20, 30 connection strings in an environment for each individual file that they're trying to import, instead of just creating a dynamic uh, connection string, a dynamic connector, um, where you could just pass in the variable for like the blob container or for the file name, because maybe the file name changes with various scenarios. Oh, Gene says all the time that he thinks about scaling. That's awesome. Um, good job, Gene. But you, and it really creating these to be dynamic really helps you to keep your environment clean, um, and keeps again, not hard coding dates and things will keep your ETL pipelines running smoothly and efficiently for years to come. Um, and with hard coded paths change over time. Again, create some type of global variable or parameter file where you could easily change those file paths, and it's not hard coded in your query logic. And definitely don't hard code business logic into queries. Make that kind of stuff table driven, where you could easily change it, or even better, where you could have somebody create like a power app where your business users can easily change their business logic because some new metric that they want to measure has come in. Um, which happens all the time, right? And you don't want to have a whole production cycle, a whole, SLDC cycle, which is software development life cycle, right? Um, SDLC. And This way you don't have to have that whole cycle. You don't have to create a whole project just because there's a new metric. You've created it to be table driven, it's dynamic. Your business users have a way to go in and update that, and they could do it themselves, and it could be done quickly without that whole cycle. It doesn't take a month to get done. All right. So, what is the craziest thing that you have ever seen hard coded? For those of you that are listening to the recast or the recording, let me know down in the chat, down in the discussion, down in the comments of the video. For those of you that are here with me live, if you've seen some crazy hard coded stuff, let me know. I'm sure Nathan's seen some. And I'm sure some of the rest of you have seen some. So let me know in the chat what's some of the craziest things that you've seen over the years. Um, I'd love to know. So again, as always, just let me know in the chat if there's anything that comes up that you have questions about. All right. So pitfall number 4: poor naming conventions. This is one that I see from especially freshers, entry level people all the time, right? Is that you know especially for people that maybe they've been even people that aren't freshers, right? People that have been like the only data person in an org, and they're used to just creating their own naming style, and maybe they've never had any data governance or standards that were enforced on them or that they had created or followed, and so they've just come up with their own naming conventions. Well, there are some standard naming conventions out there, first of all, for data warehouses and for for databases, and you should have a standards document with what your naming standards are for your organization. This should be something that you should create. If you don't have it already, it should be something that should be out there, hopefully already. And if it is, make sure that you're following as close as you could be expected to, right? There's always some variations that pop up, but generally try to stay close to the naming conventions that are set for your org. Have you ever opened a pipeline and seen some variables in there, just like T1, T2, T3, or maybe people are naming their subqueries in production A, B, and C, and they're not real descriptive, right? And especially queries that may be hundreds of lines long, that have multiple subqueries or multiple CTEs, and you just have like CTE 1, 2, and 3. Make your name use a descriptive naming convention when you're creating these. You will thank yourself 6 months, a year from now, when you have to go back and revise or update or refactor some of this code, and you're trying to figure out what these variables are for and what these subqueries and CTEs and things like that are for. Poorly named resources really cause a lot of confusion, not just for other people, but for yourself as you are investigating things when you come back to them, again, to make changes, because changes will occur. uh, things change in business, so you're going to have to come back to it, and usually when you come back to it, it's 6 months, even 2-3 years down the road. So you want to be sure to use really good naming conventions, and we'll get to it here in a minute, but you'll also want to be sure to provide some clear documentation, especially if you had to use some workaround to get through something. um, Again, if you don't have standards in your org now, go ahead and start writing some standards. If you're the only data person, even if you're the only data person in your group, go ahead and write some standards. One, to hold yourself accountable, and two, so that when new people do come in, or when you have to hand something off because you got promoted into another org or another company, then they could kind of follow along and see why you name things certain ways. So that's my big tip for that piece. Um, and we've all seen crazy naming conventions, right? What? Let me know. For those of you that have run into that, let me know down in the comments. What is the weirdest or most confusing name that you've ever seen for a variable or a subquery or even a view, right? I've seen some views that said like Doug Vincent's view, and it was specifically for this person, right? And so make sure that, and what does that mean? What did Doug need at that time that person created that view? So be descriptive, be appropriately descriptive. Doug Vincent's view doesn't help anybody. Maybe Doug at some point. Okay, so pitfall number 5. I've got an extra one here in a second that I'm going to go over, but pitfall number 5 is not asking questions. There's this concept in business and in data called peeling back the onion. Especially stakeholders come to you and they ask for something. And that ask is always kind of just surface deep, right? It is important to peel back that onion, especially as a data engineer, and ask questions. Ezekiel, I'll get to your question here in a second. Let me go through this last one, and then I'll jump to your question, sir. But ask questions. Ask things like, has this data ever changed? When they tell you no, don't believe them. Go out and do your own exploratory analysis and figure out that it has. Ask questions about what the data's for, why they're doing this, what business questions that they're trying to answer by getting this data. Make sure that you're asking questions. If you're not asking 5 or 6 questions at the beginning of every project, then you're not asking enough questions. So come up with 5 or 6 questions at the beginning of each project that is specific to that project. I would always make sure to ask, what business questions are you answering with this data, with this project? And that will give you some insight as to what that data is going to be used for, how it's going to be used, and what process that you may need to clean that data. But freshers, especially kind of hesitate. They're so eager to jump in and help that they hesitate to really ask a lot of questions, and might even think that their questions are not valid. Somebody else has those questions too. So be sure that you're asking those questions. Clarify requirements up front. You don't want to get 3 weeks, a month into a project only to find out that you need to turn around and go a completely different direction. So ask those clarifying questions up front. Never think that your questions are stupid. Know that somebody else in the room probably has the same question, and they also are just not brave enough to raise their hand and ask. So ask questions. Don't hesitate. For those of you that are on, we're getting a pretty good crowd. Let me know down in the chat, what is a time that not asking a question really bit you in the end and caused a lot of rework because you didn't ask a question? I'd love to hear those scenarios. I've got a few. I'm happy to share if you're interested, but let me know in the chat. All right, let me get to Ezekiel's question here. What are the type data structures and algorithm questions asked in data engineering interviews? I know it's different from what software engineers ask. What should we focus on? So it's a great question. Too dynamic. Yeah. So that's a great question. Questions asked in a data engineering interview are generally not a lot of like algorithm type questions, right? They might ask you things like, what Python library do you use to retrieve API data, right? And the answer to that question is requests. If you come from a software engineering background, you may know that, likely know that already. But they'll ask you more questions about, um, how do you write a query to aggregate data? How do you clean data? What is your methodology when it comes to data modeling? Um, what are the different types of dimensions, and why would you, in what scenarios would you use each one? I've been asked, in what's have you ever used a cross query, and what specific times have you used a cross query, and what's the result of it? What's a Cartesian join? I've been asked what's a Cartesian join, and what is a good business reason to create a Cartesian join? Um, those are more the types of questions that you're going to be asked. Have you ever, built out a project in Azure, and what resources do you need to spin up, Synapse environment? Um, Different things like that. Those are kind of more the direction people will go in data engineering interviews. Um, it depends heavily on the position. In some cases, you'll be asked things like more cloud specific. Maybe, if it's a group that uses Snowflake, you're going to be asked more Snowflake specific type things. Maybe how to create a stage, or how to access an S3 bucket, things like that. If it is more Azure, based, you may be asked more Fabric type questions. How to how to spin up a SQL Server resource. I've been asked things like, you know, um, how do you, what distributive computing is, how to use parallelism in Spark, things like that. Those are how to take, what are the steps that you take when a query becomes inefficient, and how would you examine that information to identify kind of efficiency gaps, and things that those are the direction that your data engineering questions are going to go, interview questions are going to go. But great question, thank you, hopefully that helped. um, when it comes to gnarly hard coding in SQL, what comes to mind when developers make things too dynamic? See, they're just now, this is a great question, and kind of leads back into Ezekiel's question too. um, you know there's a balance, right? Just, it's similar to indexing, right? With indexing, indexing is important, uh, just as important as distribution. But if you over index, then you cause issues, because over index, indexing slows down write operations. It speeds up your analysis, it speeds up your queries, but it slows down your write operations. And so making things too dynamic can also do the same thing, because you're always retrieving all of these different variables, and you have to create all these variables, and sometimes those variables require some calculations, or some um, sometimes there's some aggregation that occurs in order to get to a specific value to use it in a dynamic query. um, so especially, and that happens more, I see that more happen within the realm of, SDEs, software developers that are writing SQL too, because they don't have a data engineer on the project. Then generally I see from data engineers. um, all right, Nathan, thinking of nesting views and sort procedures, or using, say, Python templating to create DDL SQL statements with variables for names and fields, including indexes, views, and sprocs. Nested, there's you run into some. My preferred thing, as opposed to using sprocs, especially with it depends on your environment, right? If you're on prem, and you're still using SSIS to do your ETL, and you're wanting to use Sprox to handle some of that load, then I think that that's fine. Um, if you're in a cloud environment, I would put a lot of that logic that you would do in Sprox, I would put it into your workflow, into your, if you're using Informatica, then it's called a task flow or a workflow. If you're on-prem, if you're in Azure, then you're using a pipeline. And I would try to put that logic within your pipeline, as opposed to trying to run stored procedures. Or if you're in like Databricks, right, and or even if you're in Azure, right, and you're in Synapse, then you could use notebooks and to write Python to do a lot of that heavy lifting, right? Um, but I would put it there. I wouldn't put it in Sprox. And nested views really start to get confusing and inefficient, depending on how nested that you get. All right. So thanks, Nathan. I appreciate that. So currently doing my bachelor's in data science at ASU Online. Worked with SQL DBA as a SQL DBA for 3 years now. What would you recommend to confidently transition to data engineering? I think that the DBA work that you're doing, again, I think that this, I know that this heavily depends on the role that you're in and the company that you're in. But hopefully as a DBA, you've gotten a lot of opportunity to do like indexing and to check and see like the efficiency of queries, and you're that kind of DBA, right? If not, I would look for those opportunities now and start practicing those types of situations. And providing, if you have a chance to work with a data engineering group, hopefully you probably work closely with your data engineering group, maybe. If you're in a company that's big enough that you have a whole data engineering team, and work with that data engineering team, see if there's any tech debt. If you have some bandwidth in your current role, see if there's any tech debt that you could take on and help with. And that will help you to, one, build some rapport and kind of build some goodwill with that team and probably the leader of that team. And will help you to get some more real world data engineering experience by doing that. In addition, you might pick up, I think, the ASU Online program is really fantastic and they do a really good job, I think, preparing you, especially if you have some real world experience, especially as a DBA. You probably see a lot of the kind of crap data that goes on, especially being there for 3 years. So you probably see, that garbage in, garbage out kind of concept moving through there at times. So you have some concept of what real world data might look like. You might hear it from some of your coworkers. You might look at getting like the Databricks data engineer certification, or one of Azure, AWS data engineer associate certifications, and take a look at those. That might help. I really do believe, though, that the biggest things that you could do, especially if you're in a DBA position now, is to network with your data engineering and data analyst teams and data science teams, and see if there's anything that you could do to help those teams. And maybe even if it's picking up some extra work that you could work on, I think that again builds goodwill. You're networking, you're getting out there. And then also, I preach this all the time: network on LinkedIn. It will help you when you do apply for jobs. If it's outside of your current company, then make sure that you're reaching out to hiring managers or people that are working in that company that might be able to give you some insight as to what it's like working there and things like that. Real World 369. Hi, welcome. Fresher intern at TCS. Passionate about data engineering. Want to know how to become a data engineer and what technologies I should learn and how to handle the project from scratch. That is an amazing question and a big question. So That's exciting. I am also passionate about data engineering. If you cannot tell, a lot of us are. Uh, Nathan has a background in some software development, and has been getting more into data engineering. And Nathan Smith, that's on. We'll be doing a another call with another session with him here before too much longer, hopefully. And then I have another person that is going to come on. Her name is the data coach, or she goes by the data coach, and her name is Lindsay, and she's going to come on May 2nd. Um, but real world, how to become a data engineer. What are your fresher intern in TCS? So again, I think that question um, ties hand in hand with uh, the previous question that we talked about, right? Go out, make sure that you're networking, reach out to your data engineering team in your internship company and try to pick up some work for them if you get, and try to even if it's just saying hey, introducing yourself, letting them know that you are interested in data engineering. If you don't proactively and kind of scream out for yourself, nobody else is going to know to help you along with those things. So reach out to those other people. Again, see if there's any real world work that you could help with. They might not give you a lot at first, but a lot of times, if you raise your hand and say, I'd love to help you with some of your tech debt, they're more than happy to see what it is that you can help with. Because a lot of tech debt is some simple stuff. You might be doing some documentation, but it gives you some exposure into that real world and being able to turn around. And, that's my sixth pitfall that freshers run into, is not documenting well enough. But I think that if you get a chance even to do some documentation, even to do some, you know, if your company maybe is picking up something like Purview or something like that, and they need help with that type of documentation, um, then I would volunteer to help with some of that, and that'll give you some real world insight as to what's going on. And then handle the project. What technology should I learn to handle the project from scratch? This again, there are so many tools as a data engineer that we see come in and out. There are multiple cloud environments, whether it's Azure, AWS, GCP. Um, there's a ton of ETL tools, Informatica. We've got the AWS Glue, the Azure Synapse, Azure Data Factory. We have obviously old school. We've got SSIS that you'll still run into quite a bit. There's some Estuary. We've got Mage AI that's coming in. There's a ton of tools out there. The way that I do my mentoring program, um, you could go online to gambledataengineering.com, and you'll see the kind of the process I go through for my one mentoring program. Is I have people start out by picking five uh, five job recs for jobs and companies that they're really passionate about joining, and we research those, identify the tools and resources and the cloud environment that is most common among those, and then use that to build your project that you'll use to put into your GitHub repository and to use um, for your portfolio that you'll use to try to get into a position. And and so that's how I'd handle that project, right? Go out, find 5 or 10 job positions that look like this is something I'd really love doing. I really want to work for this company, and see what cloud environment they use. See what ETL tools might be listed on their job rec. See what environments that they're in, whether it's Python or maybe they're really entirely like a SQL shop, whether or not they use Airflow and DBT, things like that. And then that'll help to kind of guide you um, along that path. If you really want to, things that like are common, get to know Git, right? Get to know and get familiar with Git. Um, Make sure that you have a Git repo, that you have your own personal Git repo in your own account. get familiar with pushing and pulling and committing and documenting. SQL is obviously important. Python is important, but not always important, depending on the position. So I could go on and on about this, but those that hopefully will kind of give you an idea. Um, SQL. For the Python interview round, I thought they would ask DSA questions. If not, you know, it if you're applying for a data science position, absolutely, they're going to ask some DSA questions. Um, you know, Python interview questions that companies outside of Fang ask. Um, Again, what library do you use to access to retrieve API data? What if they're an AWS shop, they'll probably ask you what Python library do you use to access S3 buckets? What Python library do you use to access the AWS CLI? Right? Um, what Python, how would you script out pulling a data from a specific API, cleaning that data, and pushing it into a data warehouse or a data lake? And how would you ensure that the data is accurate and whole when you do land it in, load it into its kind of endpoint? Um, and so you're looking at things like making sure that you're telling them what libraries you use. So for that specific scenario, you're talking Bodo, right? For the AWS piece, you're talking the request library for the accessing the API. You might be looking at PyODBC for maybe some database connections. You'll be talking about maybe doing some asserts, right? You got to do an assert to compare your data to make sure that it matches in the endpoint as well as in your source, and make sure that you didn't lose any fidelity along the way. Um, Things like that are what they're looking for, especially as you move up into higher level data engineering positions. Hopefully that kind of helps clarify that. I wouldn't, generally they're not going to ask any really, like, they're not going to ask you to create any visuals, because visuals are not going to be what a data engineer is going to do, especially in Python. Um, but they will ask that kind of how you would create that pipeline for that data. Talking about pandas or polars, especially for big data. They might ask you, have you ever worked with Parquet files? And what's the advantage of using a Parquet file versus CSV file? Things like that will come up. Great. Thank you all for joining tonight. I really just wanted to take a moment and say thank you. There's a lot of new faces here, a lot of new names here. Super excited. And that you all are here tonight. All right. Yeah, that's true. Thank you for the solid advice and clarity. We'll be hopping into an SSIS package deployment project soon. For those of you that are neglecting SSIS, SSIS is still a big thing for companies. Companies are not as far along in their cloud migrations as a lot of other companies that maybe do cloud migrations would lead you to expect. There's a lot of companies still out there that have legacy SSIS packages. Maybe they're still mid migration into Azure or AWS, and they haven't migrated everything yet because they have some really huge and difficult SSIS packages. Somebody just told me the other day that they had a SSIS package with 1,000 different tasks in it, and that is just insane to me. That's a huge SSIS package. Okay, so I don't like coding that much, nor DSA. Should I still get into data engineering? I want to get this job. I think I could go from it to product management or business analysis. If business analysis is your end goal, I would jump straight into business analyst position. I don't know that a data engineering position is going to be the route. Now, if you don't like coding or DSA, the data structure piece, then the data structure piece you're not going to get out of, right? Right? But the data science piece, the algorithm piece, you're probably not going to see a lot of as a data engineer. Um, you will in some positions, everything is a low code tool, right? You may run into positions where you are only using like informatica, and it is dragging and dropping nodes and populating different variables basically, and making connections to different data sources, and you might not run into any Python at all. I've seen positions where there's no Python involved, and no Java involved or anything like that. Um, but data structures, you're not going to get out of. Understanding data structures is important as a data engineer. If you do want to get into product management or business analysis, again, I jumped straight into a business analyst positions, and then look at moving from a business analyst into a product manager. That would be kind of my direction that I'd go. Especially also that data engineering is a thankless job and getting credits whenever I deserve it. Data engineering is not always a thankless job. It's not. That sometimes they'll hire you as a data engineer and you're the only data person there, and you are the wizard for the company. You are pulling data and automating processes that they've been doing manually for years. I'm working a contract now where they are literally running a report, exporting it as a CSV, doing VLOOKUPs to other reports that they get via email, or typing in manually data that they're getting in from email into an Excel file, and then creating some like pivot tables and pivot charts from that, and then copy and pasting those into another like a Word doc, and then creating a PDF and sending that to their bosses. When you come in there and you automate all that so that they don't have to do all that anymore, I promise you that those people are extremely thankful, and it is not always a thankless job. Now, I'll say that I have been parts of groups where we had a whole data engineering team, like we had 5 or 6 data engineers on a team, and that was a little bit more of a thankless job because the company didn't look at us as a wizard. They looked at us as a roadblock to getting what they wanted, because there were so many policies and procedures put in place that it took a long time to do anything. And we weren't doing a lot of automating. We were doing a lot of creating new stuff, and it didn't. It was a little bit more thankless. We weren't seen as quite as glorified as some other positions that I've been in. Hopefully that helps. Great questions tonight, guys. Thank you all so much for jumping on. So we talked through tonight the 6 things, really. Again, documentation is the 6th thing that a lot of freshers fall into that they don't think about doing. Documentation is extremely important, especially as a fresher. Documentation is super important for seniors. It's super important for staff level positions. Super important for freshers. If you have ever cracked open a ETL pipeline that didn't have any documentation as to why certain things were there, or certain things were done a certain way, or you cracked open a stored procedure, and I had one that was 4,000 lines, and it was very scarcely documented, and it's hard to follow. Things start getting really hard to follow when you're talking thousands of lines sometimes. So document. So kind of the quick wins here, right, that we talked about. Always profile your data. Make sure you're doing your exploratory data analysis. Make sure that you're profiling your data before you start diving into actually creating the pipeline and creating your tables for the data. Plan for scalability up front. Don't jump right in and be so much in a hurry to get the project done that you don't take the time to think about scale, to think about efficiency, to think about, okay, this is running great with these 300 lines or 10,000 lines. What's going to happen when I have a million lines? What runs in 10 seconds now because of with 10,000 lines is going to run in 5 minutes when it has tens of millions of lines. So be aware of those types of things. Say no to hard coded values. Um, do not, do not take the bait that business logic will never change. I promise you, if is they are lying to you, if they tell you there's three things that the business tells you that are always a lie. This data set is never going to change. It's always going to look like this. This metric is always going to be important. We're always going to use it, and we're always going to calculate it this way. And three is this data set has never changed. The other end, right? Historically, yes, I need you to load the last 5 years of data. It's always been the same, and don't worry about it. You're good. Those are always lies. Don't believe them. So use next piece. Use clear and concise naming conventions. Again, don't fall for just creating CTE 1, 2, and 3. Be sure that you're clearly documenting. Clearly creating using some naming standards. And if you don't have any standards currently for your group, go ahead and take the time to create some standards. And then ask questions without hesitation. Don't never be ashamed or afraid to ask questions, especially as a project is starting up. It's going to save you time in the long run and going to make you look like that much more of a star when you're able to really deliver the product that they're looking for as opposed to the product that they asked for. I know that sounds like that might be the same thing, but I promise you it's not. That's the fourth lie that businesses tell you is that what their ask is when they're asking you something. It's they might ask you for one thing, but what they're looking for might be something completely different. So again, we are running to the end of our hour. Let me know in the comments what final questions that you may have. Thank you again so much for all of our new faces tonight. Excited to see you here. If anybody is interested in mentoring, go to dataengineering.com and you could take a look at the mentoring page. And there's a Calendarly link for you to go out and sign up for some time. And then happy to get you on the schedule. And yeah, again, let me know if there's any other final questions. Next week, I am going to kind of walk through a bot that I created. And I'm going to walk through step by step, show you the code that I wrote. Might show you a little bit right now, really quick. And really, it kind of leads into the mentoring piece. So I'm gonna share my screen here and show you all real quick this bot that I created in Streamlit. I don't know if that's still. Let's see. Stop. Boom, boom. Need to share the whole window. Okay. So in Streamlit, so created this mentee skill assessment and quiz. What this does is it prompts you for some questions, right? What your name is, your email address. Again, this is the sign up page for the mentoring. Why do you want a mentor? For those of you that are already mentees, it's basically the Word doc that I sent you, really just in a web version. But the added excitement here that I was able to add is after you fill out all of the different answers and you do your self-assessment at the very end here, um, you hit CS, let's proceed. When you hit submit self-assessment, it's going to go out and it's going to hit the Open AI API, and it's going to retrieve 10 questions based on your self-assessment. And once it takes a couple seconds uh, because it just does. But then you see the personalized quiz set up, and you could go through and answer the questions in the quiz, and then at the end you'll hit submit quiz, and it'll tell you, in this case I didn't make any changes to anything, but I scored 4 out of 10. Um, and all of that information, once you hit submit quiz, gets sent to me, and it gets sent, you'll see it in the upper right hand corner, it's running, but it emails to me. It provides a feedback summary. Again, the email failed to send, probably because my token timed out, and I'll have to update that. But you see, it'll give you a feedback summary based on the questions that you answered right and wrong. Um, it says it seems like you may be struggling with some of the concepts related to blah, blah, blah. So it gives you some a response, a feedback summary. All this gets theoretically emailed to me, but it also gets dumped into as a JSON payload into my Azure blob. And you'll see here, we'll see mentee responses. Oh, it didn't mail because I didn't put an email address in here or a name. So that's why the mail failed. But you'll see the mentee result. You'll see 10:56:17 p.m., which is just now. And you will see this JSON file that gets sent to me. So I get the timestamp, I'll get all the answers for the assessment. I'll get the quiz questions that you got asked and what your answers were, what the correct answers were, as well as the feedback summary that ChatGPT gave. And then it also actually creates I have it build, ChatGPT build a project suggestion based on the answers that you provided, right? And what your skill set currently is. And so all that gets sent to me so that I can prepare for our mentoring meeting. And so then my next step with this is to take it, and I'll create a pipeline that gets triggered once that file hits that ADLS container, and push that data into a SQL table, and then I could create a Power BI report based on that, right? And so that is the project that I'm probably going to show you all next week. Super excited about it. I stopped sharing. I actually meant to show you some of the Python code behind that, but let me actually show you some of the Python code behind that that's going on there. Super excited to share that next week. And here I'm going to show you some of the Python code behind here. But basically, again, we're using the Streamlit library. We're using the OpenAI library, right, to hit OpenAI and to for that interactive piece, right? Again, those questions are never going to be the same every time when you go back. If you go in, 3 months from now, and you've improved on some of your skills, and you move those slider bars to the right some, and you hit that create quiz, it's going to give you different questions that are appropriate for your skill level. And so this is the script, right? We're using Streamlit, JSON. We're getting the date time library, OpenAI, like I said, the Azure storage library, SMTP library for sending the email, and then the MIME text. And then here, this is kind of the security piece, right? And we have the keys, and the keys are stored within Streamlit in the kind of private key vault that Streamlit has. we have a state where I'm setting the score state as 0 so that the kind of the web front end understands what the current state is. Um, Here's the function to upload the JSON payload to Azure. Again, we're setting some state information here with whether or not the quiz was started, whether or not the quiz was submitted, basically so that the page doesn't refresh every time you click an option. Here's the page setup with, again, we're using this Streamlit library is what the ST is, and this is our page config. Really, this is just setting the page title. Again, we have the title, we have just some words, right? So it's just the st.write for the words. We have a header section for this. And then here you see that I'm collecting data, right? The mentee name, mentee email, asking for your email address. Why do you want to mentor? Short-term goals, all those various data points that we're asking for in that web form. And we're gathering that information. We're assigning those results that you choose to those variables so that those variables can be put into a couple different things as we go down through here, right? Here in a minute, you'll see that we're going to create the prompt to ask ChatGPT for the questions right here. You'll see that we're have a button, this is our button for our submit self-assessment. And then we create the skill summary list. And so it creates the list of your skills and how you rated yourself. And then that gets fed into, again, here into the prompt. So we see the skill summary here. Along with, okay, we want you to return back. We're telling ChatGPT, we're telling OpenAI, when you give me the questions, this is the format that I want them in so that I can render them in the web form, right? Here we see the response. So client.chat.completions.create is the response back from ChatGPT. Again, this is kind of both, right? The response is that's kind of the variable that we're putting it in, but this is the request to ChatGPT. This is the prompt, right, that we're feeding from that above prompt. We have a project response, which is, again, the response back. Again, I'm creating there's a project prompt as we get down through here. Here it is. Again, asking ChatGPT to create a project based on the fact, it says you're a professional data career coach. Again, just a normal prompt for ChatGPT. The data source should be free or low cost related to the below passion areas. And again, I'm feeding in the skills, your passions into ChatGPT so that I could get a full project for you. And then usually I have to go through, again, just like other things, ChatGPT is not perfect. I usually have to go through and make adjustments. Usually it doesn't give me valid web links. Usually it makes up some random web links, and I'll have to go out and find some data sources, and that's going to cause me to change around your project a little bit. But that's kind of what I found as I was testing it this past week. But yeah, and then again, that all this gets put together into this JSON payload. This is this results JSON payload. It creates this file name based on your name and the current date time. So it's a unique file name. And then it runs the upload to Azure Blob function with that result for the JSON payload and the file name. And then finally, it'll let you know that your results are saved to the cloud. Here's your personalized feedback. Again, that response back from ChatGPT. And then sends the follow-up email to you, letting you know, here's what your assessment results were, and it gives you a Calendly link for scheduling time with me. So that's that. That's the Python behind that. So stop sharing. Any questions, thoughts? Happy to share anything about that. I know there's not a whole lot of people left on. I ran over my hour. All right. Well, if there are no final questions or about data engineering or about the project that I'm going to talk more about next week, um, then then I'll let you all get back to it. But like I said, next week I'll go through kind of how I am taking that JSON payload and flattening it, and then pushing that into a into some SQL tables, into some uh, in an Azure SQL server, and then how I'm able to kind of report off of that and see a list of current mentees and what their results are. Thank you. Yeah. So again, even if you don't want to get into mentoring, just you could go out there and kind of play with that. You could get to that link via the website on the mentoring page now, instead of downloading um, a Word doc for the mentoring assessment. It will take you to that page um, and let you fill it out, and you could go through the quiz, and you could play with the quiz if you want. So feel free to do that if you're interested. But uh, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this session, and super excited about next session. It's kind of showing off that project too. So again, you could always reach out to me, chris.gamble@gambledataengineering.com, and shoot me an email. You'd always reach out to me in the community page via one of the posts, or you could always comment on any of the videos that you watch. And I will get back to you. We also have a Discord if you're interested. It's getting more interactive, but it doesn't get real. Nobody gets real chatty, but trying to build that community there as well. Here's the Discord link for anybody that is interested in joining our Discord. But hope you all had fun. Hope you enjoyed the session tonight. We do these at 10 p.m. on Friday nights, pretty much every Friday night. Always looking for people that might like to join me and have a conversation about data, whether it be data engineering, analysis, what your current data journey has been like. Happy to host you and have you on. Like I said, have a couple of exciting sessions coming up with Nathan and with Lindsay, who is the data coach. She works for nonprofits and really has a unique perspective on what it's like working for a nonprofit or a government entity that maybe doesn't always have the funding that some of the larger corporations have, and they don't often have big teams like larger corporations have. So, but super excited about those sessions coming up, and look forward to seeing you all next Friday night. I'll talk to you again soon.